Hello, my name is Asher. I'm going to be walking you through my project on the film industry of Egypt. My name is Asher. I'm from Vanguard University, and we'll get right into it. So first and foremost, we have our introduction, and so I'm going to just talk a little briefly about the industry as a whole, and then we're going to go through the origins of it, how it came to be, the evolution, kind of what shaped it into what it is today, the golden age, the state ownership, because Egypt went under state ownership for a while, the film industry did. And then we have on the second half of the presentation, Egypt film industry today, the globalization, televangelism, rating and censorship, and then we're going to go over the conclusion, just kind of wrap it all up. So first and foremost, the introduction. So the Egyptian film industry has over 100 years of film industry with a scope and length that rivals even that of Hollywood. So that's pretty cool. Currently, it produces 30 to 40 films per year. What's interesting about this is, to my research, it kind of produced more films in the 1950s every year than it does right now. It is worth 1.2 billion Egyptian dollars per year, and that's roughly 26 million US dollars every single year. And then the film city is Cairo, and that is going to be what they call the Hollywood of the Nile. So now moving on, we have the origins. So the origins of the film industry begin in 1896 when the Lumiere brothers screened a film in the Zawani Cafe in Alexandria. And so they screened the first film there, and then they screened more just kind of all around Egypt, especially Alexandria and Cairo. And then after this, a few short films were filmed throughout Egypt. The first one shot there was Plaza de Consulas Alexandre in 1896, and that was basically just what we would consider today to be like a video of a landmark in Egypt. So what we would take like with an iPhone whenever we visit like a new place, that was a short film, and that was like a really big deal. So then the first full-length film began in 1923 with In the Country of Tutankhamun. And honestly, for the life of me, I could not figure out what this film was about. There's just not a lot of information about it other than it was the first film, the full-length film in Egypt. And at this time, these were still silent films. So now to the evolution. So 1927 marks the real start of the film industry with the movie Layla. And so Layla was really the brainchild of Aziza Amir in the bottom right corner here, and she was an actress in this era of Egyptian cinema, and she was just so well known, super famous. She was actually a theater actress, and then she kind of moved on into this whole film industry. And so she doesn't have directing credits rather for this film, even though she really did direct it. I want to say she kicked the director off of it because she didn't like the direction it was going. So she acted it and basically directed the film. So then from 1927 to 34, film production increased from 2 to 6 films per year. So that was a really large increase, especially for them starting from such small origins and in that short amount of time. So then the film industry, originally, it required a lot of private investment, and it was dominated by foreigners, and interestingly enough, mostly female actresses that were deeply associated with theater. So there was no ways to fund a film other than just have private rich people do it. And at that time, most people that were interested in doing that and had the money to do that were foreigners. So that's kind of why that was the case. And there was just a lot of famous rich actresses that were famous for the theater that really wanted to get into the film industry. So that's kind of where they fit into this. Studio Mus was the first studio kind of that streamlined this, and it was created in 1935, and that's really what turned Cairo into the Egyptian Hollywood, because it had just state-of-the-art stuff, and there's a lot of really great advancements that came with that studio. So moving on into the golden age. So it is characterized by the rapid growth of the industry, and that is with 6 new studios being built. So Studio Mus still did have a lot of influence, but they didn't really control production because there were still some other studios that were built at this time. But with these new studios, they could do a lot of the stuff like editing. They had a sound stage and stuff in those studios, so they didn't have to export them and do them off-site. So that was a really big deal for the industry as a whole. So then we also have here in 1948, 345 full-length films. So that's from the inception into 1948. So, and after this, an average of 48 films were released every year, and that number continued on into around the 1990s, which is interesting because that's actually more than there are currently right now being produced every year. So that was kind of the heyday for Egyptian cinema from 1935 to 1952. But yeah, so that was a lot going on there. The most common genres were melodramatic musicals, comedies, and to a smaller extent, they had Boudoir films, and that means like Desert Dweller, and those were just films about nomadic people. So musicals were very, very, very popular in this time. So basically, they didn't have MTV or like music videos, and so these musicals were how they kept in touch with these famous musicians and celebrities. So in the top right, that is the poster for The Chant of Hope, which came out in 1937. And then the bottom right is called Love's Tears, and that came out in 1954. And those were just two very successful and important musicals that were out around this period. Moving on to state ownership and reprivatization. So to understand this area of Egyptian film, we really need to understand Egyptian history. So I am no expert in Egyptian history, but a short crash course of what went down is in 1952, the guy on the top right, Gamal Abdel Nasser, he and this group called the Free Officers, they staged a coup, and it ended the monarchy in Egypt, and it also removed a lot of British influence. So during this time, there was a lot of political films that were made. It didn't really influence the film industry as much as you would think. There was still a lot of films being produced, but it was just kind of about more political and nuanced topics like that. So that was one thing to consider. But then in 1960, the country socialized, and that brought the film industry with it. And so with that, 1/3 of the theaters socialized too, so they were under state control as well. So this didn't change the film industry very much, being socialized, but what it did was it kept it from advancing with the rest of the world. As you can imagine, from the 1960s to the 1970s, there were quite a bit of advancements in the way of films and movies. So it was very interesting to kind of see how they didn't really advance while they were under state ownership. But after only a short time, the country reprivatized around 1972, and it was sent back in the market, selling back movie theaters to the private sector. Something interesting about this is that during this time of state run, a lot of the actors, directors, and producers fled towards Lebanon and really gave a boost to the Lebanese film industry. So around this time, the rise of modern technology, it kind of transformed the industry again. And that's how we get into today. So obviously around the 70s and 80s is when like VCR tapes came out, and then satellite eventually. And so all of those things kind of changed a lot and brought us up into the common area. So today, the Egyptian film industry produces about 30 to 40 films per year. These films, though comparatively low earning to the United States, are watched throughout the Middle East. So, I mean, this film in the top right, it's called Blue Elephant. Its sequel that came out in 2019 grossed $6 million US dollars. And so obviously compared to US films, you're thinking that's not a ton of money. But for the Egyptian film industry, that is a lot of money, considering that is about 1/4 of all of the money that it brings in every year in a single film. So that was a really big deal. And that is by Synergy Films, which is one of the main producers at this time. Some of the key players in today's Egyptian cinema are Omar Sharif, Amar Waked, Yusura, who is basically like the Beyonce of Egypt, and then Yusuf Cheyenne are very well-known Egyptian film and are very household names in Egypt. In addition to this, there are many different Egyptian cinemas. So like I talked about, when it was sent back to the private sector, the cinemas were resold to private parties. And so to the best of my knowledge, basically everyone is owned by different people. So like here in the States, we have like AMC, Regal, and Cinemark, and those are kind of like the main three. But in Egypt, you just have a bunch of different ones that own them. So kind of a little bit different there. Moving on, we have globalization. So what's interesting about the Egyptian film industry, though it's not the biggest, 3/4 of all Middle Eastern films are made in Egypt. So why that's important is because every different Middle Eastern country has a different dialect. So say you were to go to Syria, and then go to Iran, they would be speaking a different dialect, and oftentimes they use different words, and different people from different Middle Eastern countries can't really speak to each other. But most Middle Eastern people still understand, at the very least, if not speak, Egyptian Arabic. And this is because most of the film and TV is in that Arabic because it comes from Egypt. So there are a lot of things that come with that, which I will talk about later. But that is actually a very key innovation for a lot of different reasons, kind of unifying a lot of the Middle East under almost a language that they all understand. So for this as well, many awards have been won for Egypt, especially from the Arab Cinema Center, the ACC, which the best I can understand is very similar to the Middle Eastern Oscars for films. The Cairo Film Festival is a prestigious film festival, and every year it receives many submissions. But with this, there are no films that have ever been shown in Egypt before. That's like one of the principles for submitting a film. So no Egyptian films are ever submitted in this film festival. So you can't give awards to Egyptian films. So they haven't really won anything in there, but that is still a really cool film festival that happens in Cairo. So for streaming services, so films are largely only available on Middle Eastern streaming sites. I tried my hardest to find like any film that I could, any Egyptian film, and I couldn't find one on any streaming service here in the States. So for example, mycinema.net and elcinema.com are two of those Egyptian streaming sites. But YouTube is still the nation's most popular streaming site. So I literally didn't know what to look up on YouTube to find one. But I've heard that that is where there are a lot of Egyptian films. So there is no mention of how much money they make from streaming services. But as far as I can tell, that is still tallied in the total price and cost of the Egyptian film industry. So moving on now to televangelism. So what I was talking about earlier with the Egyptian Arabic being a pretty common language throughout the Middle East, there are a lot of companies that use that as a tool for evangelism. So since they have that common language, there's ministries such as Sat7 and Al Hayat ministries that use the internet and satellite to broadcast Christianity throughout the Middle East. So they have television shows, radio shows, and they just talk about like a lot of different things when it comes to Christianity and put it all in the Middle East, which is largely what the Middle East doesn't have. And so, I mean, it has come under some flack because it does kind of criticize Islam, which obviously in the Middle East it is not popular to do. So I know some of the televangelists that are part of these different ministries are wanted in some of those Middle Eastern countries. So that is kind of an interesting thing that happens with that, is they're so widespread now that they are becoming known by the government. So, and then what's really interesting is that the prominent film industry has helped to spur on this ministry, even if it doesn't do it on purpose, because it has spread that language. So now moving on finally to the rating and censorship of Egyptian films. So the rating system really leaves no room for interpretation. What I mean by that is that the ratings are as follows: 12, 16, and 18. And those are like 12 and up, 16 up, and so on. And if you show a film, to my knowledge, even if it is to your own children and they are not at that age rating, so if you show an 11-year-old a 12 and up film, you will get fined for that if they find out. So it's not like here we have parental guidance like PG. If you show a young kid that, and it's kind of up to you, or if you show your own kid a PG-13 movie and they're 12, like no one's going to come after you. But in Egypt, it is not a good thing to do, and you're not allowed to do that. So what these ratings kind of look like is 12 and up is violence and sexual situations. And then if it has any of those, then it's 12 and up. If it has intense violence, crimes, sexual situations, suggestive dialogue, or crude language, then it's 16 and up. And then obviously that applies to the 12 and up as well. And then 18 up is anything that leads to delinquency or is contrary to societal values. So that's super interesting because that can kind of be up to interpretation. So that's not super clear. But what is super interesting actually is how the censorship works in Egypt. So in Egypt, there's a board that reviews all of the films twice. And if they find that the film has anything to do with homosexuality or encourages anything that is not like sponsored by the state or the state doesn't believe in, or actually breeds conflict with a different country, then it is just outright banned. So it is not allowed to be shown in theaters and not allowed to be produced. So it is very strict, and it's very important that they follow this, or else they will kind of get doxxed by the government. Even movie theaters are under these guidelines, so if they are found to not have strict enough enforcements on these age rating systems, then they will be fined as well. Moving on to our conclusion, the Egyptian film industry has a rich, long history, and it has origins that can be traced back to the 19th century, and it's grown and developed immensely. From being mostly foreign-driven to eventually looking internally, Egypt grew to produce nearly 40 films every year, and it became one of the most prominent film producers in the Middle East, spreading their language far and wide, and that is used for a lot of different things, including televangelism. Today, their film industry is quite strong, and although they produce less films than they did back in the 50s, they still do have a higher monetary return on that. So it is very strong, almost stronger than it ever has been, and it seems to be growing. So I'm expecting the film industry to grow quite a bit in the next few years and just continue on that trend of being the most prominent in the Middle East. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you guys so much for listening.